You have a paper titled Endless Forms Most Beautiful, Teleonomy and Bioengineering of Chimeric and Synthetic Organisms. So tell me about that.
Yeah, it's a mouthful for one. So colloquially, we just call it endless forms because it's easier. But it's a paper that Mike Levin and I wrote together. I think within like the first year of me joining the lab, that talks about kind of an approach to trying to understand biology. There's a nice figure, and I think it was actually we got very lucky. I think they made it the top of the figure on the journal of kind of this branching different forms of life. And the idea is that goal-directedness seems to be a very interesting way to approach understanding biological systems, regardless of scale. You have goals. You want to interview me on a podcast, do well in whatever you're doing with life. My heart has goals. It would like to continue beating. Cells have goals. They don't want to die potentially, or they're wanting to balance some membrane potential. Um, and so it's an interesting framework that it applies to every single level. And unfortunately, biology is very complicated, much to the chagrin of the researchers. It's frustratingly complicated sometimes, and some of that is because like the way systems have grown and coupled together over like evolutionary timescales makes things very hard to potentially piece apart. Like, oh, why is this doing this? Why this goal? Why that? Why this? Um, and so part of the aims of the paper or the idea that we're trying to get across is synthetic biology, um, which sounds fancy, but it just means like biology that doesn't exist naturally, at least to me. So when you create something slightly new or different, uh, you might the way these two so you have two living pieces, right? Let's say you have organism A and B or part of A and B, and you fuse them together and they continue to live. Uh, do they do A's goals? Do they do B's goals? Do they have a new goal C, or do they work together? How do the systems interact? And because you've removed part of that from the, of course, those pieces have evolved, but when you put them together, um, most of the time, if you design things correctly, they'll continue to live potentially. And the new things that they do are interesting, and you can explore them kind of taken outside of some evolutionary timeline because you created it. So the idea is to get at like maybe general principles of different parts of biological organization in general.
Mm.
Yeah.
So if I understand that, so we start from many different aspects of biology. You could think about a whole organism, but you could think about a heart or different parts. They have goals. It's a good way of thinking about how they work. And so yeah, and then okay, imagine, and we can talk about the kinds of organisms you guys create, and that may be possible. You can make synthetic ones, put them together, and if you study that, then you kind of you can study so many things like why and how do they work together, what new goals does
Yeah.
that new thing
Yeah. No,
have
that's
now,
exactly the
and
point.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's two core components to why this is, I think, a very valid and valuable way to approach biology, and I think Mike does too because he keeps paying me. Um, is that I think everyone would agree that biology is hyper competent at different scales. Like if you learned a new skill, your heart doesn't stop beating. You can eat and chew and breathe and do all these things, and Jack, can set your goals in life, and that has to propagate down a bit, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe the goal to go get a coffee, doesn't really change how your heart works necessarily or your genes. But the goals of the higher systems that are coupled to these lower ones, they can all work assuming that the other ones work well. Like running a company, the CEO does some things and it works because he knows that the people that work there, can pursue their goals with a degree of competency. So the cool part about this synthetic biology idea is that whatever the systems in these two pieces that you're putting together, or three if you're being crazy, or more, is that all the pieces are very, very competent. And so when you put them together, you can watch how they work. You don't need to do anything, right? You can just put them together and they will do. And typically, if the goal was not clear before, you might see like, oh, I see they've reorganized in this way, maybe that's what they were doing the whole time, but because it's already so well done, it's kind of hidden inside the organism. You didn't get to see it. Or you can see, oh, hot damn, they're changing themselves in order to get to this goal in a way that I've never seen before. So you'd call that almost like not a mechanism, but like the skills that they have to achieve the goal kind of come out in a new when they are put into a new form, which lets you see a bit more clear.
What are some good examples for just trying to practically
Yeah.
specific thing? I'm just trying to visualize what are we talking about here when we fuse different organisms together.
It can be a couple different things. So I personally I work in neural cultures, which doesn't. I mean, those are kind of synthetic in and of themselves. So I take parts of brains and they're removed from their bodies and placed in a fake environment on a microelectrode array. Um, and of course, the neurons are going to keep doing what they're doing. And I've built, with the help of a lot of people, a system that lets me record their electrical activity and then stimulate in response. So, like a closed loop system. And the idea is that there's a virtual world. It's very simple, like a 1D or a 2D world running on the computer. The actions of the neurons change the state of the avatar in the game. And then parts of the environment are encoded in these stimulations back to the culture. So that's a good example. I mean, of just what I do, so I can toot my own horn. Um, if you're interested, there's a guy in Georgia, Steve Potter, who did a lot of this back in the 2000s, the late 90s. So it's synthetic. These neurons, these cultures have goals. I don't know what they are. I'm not very clever. But when you put them in this closed loop system, you can watch how they reorganize as a function of this new environment, and hopefully get it. Oh, I see what they were maybe trying to do here, do here, do here. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
So there are probably lots of examples, and it's interesting you bring that up. So in that scenario, you're using actual, say, biological neurons, and you're training it to move in a landscape, your computer landscape it's never
yeah,
used before. Right.
exactly. Yeah, it's a completely unfamiliar territory. It's never been in it before. Now, the important part is neurons they are, I mean, neural tissue. So again, I say tissue because it's not just neurons. There's like astrocytes and glia, at least in my setup. They are used. I mean, they're habituated to electrical stimulation, right? That's how a lot of how they communicate. Not all, but a huge part of their communication is bioelectricity. And so it's not like I'm asking them to, physically move things around. I've coupled them in a way that at least partially makes sense to their setup. Um,
Mm.
there's other maybe more straightforward examples. There's a guy in our lab, Vasily, who he actually tries to fuse tadpole and axolotl together. I don't want to speak too much about his work because I'm not an expert in it, but he is. But when you actually make a chimeric organism, you now have the complete biological systems of two things, either competing or working together. How are they fusing? How are they not? So any of those systems are interesting to look at.
So yeah, you have a computer controlling organism. You have a kind of, I don't know what you call it. I mean, in your paper you have literally a list or a taxonomy of them. You can have cyborgs,
Yep.
biobots, biorobotics. This keep scrolling. So there's and because it's funny that you'd have to almost make a new taxonomy for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
How do we start defining the fact that we can combine all these new kinds of organisms?
Yeah. And that way they're also better, like, you can talk about them a bit more easy when you have this taxonomy. And it all gets really interesting since you brought up robotics, when you start pairing like engineering with all this stuff, or when you start pairing AI. Everyone's very hyped about ChatGPT. It's very cool. But what happens when you let some simple AI system control part of this? So let's take my example of like neurons, virtual world, and I set all the rules. I'm a very smart scientist. I do everything, and that's fine. But what happens when you let an AI system observe the dynamics of the neurons and the dynamics of the virtual world, let it understand, and then you say, okay, AI, like you try. I don't know. You set the parameters. You set the rules. Um, what happens then? Now I'm almost completely removed from the thing unless I designed the AI. So it's really cool how all this can kind of come together. That's the figure, right? The taxonomy figure, where you can have kind of engineered things, biological things, and how they come together is very, very interesting, or could be at least.
Interesting that you could get AI in to start controlling actually, you can use, for example, neurons and so yeah, it's funny. So if we start saying biology is really adaptable and they can fuse together, they can also fuse with things that are not, obviously they're not biological. So
Yeah,
and yeah, so tell me more about that and what you think the future of that might be.
sure. So before I start, I think so I know it's an approach that not everyone loves. I like it a lot, and Mike has it. I think it first came out in a paper that he called "Tame: The Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere." It's a behemoth of a paper. It's like 1,000 bajillion pages. It's very good though. But there's one figure, the axis of persuadability, that's nice, and I won't get too deep into it. But the idea is that uh, this type of adaptability, like you mentioned, or these skills, these goals, um, it's a it's a gradient, not binary. It's not like does it have goals or does it have no goals. The idea is like we have very large, far-reaching kind of temporally and spatial goals. We have a lot. We have like meta goals even. Whereas some systems work like homeostats, kind of like a thermostat. They have a set point, and they have ways in order to kind of keep that set point, your system near that set point, whatever it is. Um, but interestingly, the difference between a homeostat and I would say something higher up the scale there is that homeostats often can't set their own goals. It has it, and it works very hard within its realm to achieve it. But often it's the case that it can't set its own goals. It's kind of a slave to that goal. Uh, so I think to answer your question, um, when you're trying to fuse biology, I think this is your question, with robotics or engineered systems and things like that, what's cool is now you can start messing with the goals. So let's say I have a biological system. I'm not sure if it has meta goals and meta learning, or if it's just a homeostat, or it's like something like a clock. Like a clock has no goals; it ticks because. Um, so you don't know where your system is, but when you start trying to synthetically strap them to other things and do stuff, it lets you kind of explore like, oh, this piece looks like a homeostat. Okay, great. How do I change its set point? Or, man, I have a system of homeostats. Crap, I can't set every set point. That's impossible. Or it's like, I set this one, but now this one gets rebounded. So like the micromanagement is very, very, very intense. So then you might have to ask the question, is there some way to go one level up where I can set a goal? Like for me, I don't try to go and micro manipulate all the neurons in my dish. I try to figure out ways to communicate with the tissue as a whole. And then the tissue as a whole sets, all of these individual goals for other things there, and then it kind of propagates downwards. So when you start exploring how biology pairs with technology, whether it be AI or engineering or robotics, um, when you start with this approach, it really lets you narrow down and figure out like where your system sits. Is it a homeostat? Is a system of homeostats? Where can I hit it in terms of its organization in order to best uh, use it for whatever application or question you're trying to answer? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's that if you start fusing a biological systems with a kind of AIs or something that you can set the system to have goals in a more top down kind of fashion, you can actually, when one is, you can kind of actually learn about its competencies, because maybe before, it might just be a kind of clock like thing, but maybe it's just it never had the intrinsic goal of trying to do something more complex, and so now you're like, okay, well, let's see what can one do with all the pieces
Oh,
here.
yeah. And I personally doubt that any biological system is a clock. So a clock is like on one far end of the spectrum, it's entirely mechanical. Very similar to like historical science, where they thought, in the beginning, everything were these like perfectly tuned mechanical things all working together in concert. I think it's more likely that lower systems are similar to like homeostats or something, or they're following some very simple like gradient descent rule. And so when you
Mm.
start pairing stuff with technology or trying to strap things together, often those goals or those competencies become elucidated, and then you can start messing with them and see, like, for example, oh great, this is a homeostat. how much can I change it before the whole thing explodes? Um, or, oh, can I come at it from top down in order for it to because again, biology is competent across all these scales. Can I communicate with it at a certain level in order to see all the pieces reorganize? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to kind of learn a bit more about, given that these kinds of techniques, these kind of processes, what have we learned about the competencies of different kinds of organisms,
Mm.
and what happens when we make these kind of hybrids?
We've learned some. We've learned I think a lot, but I also would say that some of this stuff is very very new. At least talking about it in this form. Um, although we've been this idea of trying to speak to biology at a high level to get some kind of goal and see how it reorganizes seems like this lofty new thing, but we've done it forever. For example, when you get if you have ever trained a dog to sit, for example, you did not have to go in and tune all of its neurons and all of its muscles in order to sit. All you had to do is figure out how to communicate. You give a treat, you go like this, and often dogs will like sit back, and then they learn this. And I have no idea how a dog works, but I know that I can train it. So some things, like for example, one of the best books that no one has ever read is like Pavlov's old conditioning book. He was able to do some crazy stuff. This is not synthetic, even. It's that he started to realize, and I think it's there, because he even talked about it. I think the title is even a bit fancy. He talks about like the cerebral cortex and goal setting. And everyone remembers Pavlov with the meat and the bell, and then we're done. But that's like page one, and there's like many pages behind it where he trains like organs. And some of this is a bit, I doubt it would pass ethics boards today, but some of it like he trains like animals' organs. It's really weird stuff. So even without any synthetic stuff involved, we've already learned a lot about how organs work, or different parts of animals work. It turns out you can set goals most of the time, and you can get the system to reorganize. Now with the synthetic part, since you're familiar with Mike's work, um, the idea of these xenobots, and now someone else in the lab has done something called anthrobots. So these are animal caps. So during embryogenesis, they take part of the embryo, put them in a dish in a certain way, and they form together. Um, and where the AI came in to be was that they gave this AI computer system these two different types of cells, and said, like, we want motion. How do we put these cells together in a meaningful way in order to get motion? The system kind of turned and turned and turned, and came up with these templates. And then Doug Blackiston did these incredible experiments where they took the output of this AI and built these little biobots. Um, and now there's a whole branch of research people have started examining these kind of xenobots. Like, what the heck do they do? Why do they move? It turns out if you make these U-shaped ones, they'll push cells to other cells together if you put them in the dish, and they have like this kinetic replication. So boom, we've learned a ton of stuff. You take part of a system and put it in a slightly different environment. It reorganizes in order to do something. It grows cilia where it didn't have before, and then in certain contexts, it can even like kinetically replicate. Uh, and now they're trying to explore when they do kinetic replication, like, can you pass something along? Because if it can, then you're getting close to like some new, like synthetically derived form of life. It's very cool. So we've learned a lot about how some of these underlying systems work through work
Right.
like this.
Yeah. It's so strange that you wouldn't it the organisms by themselves, they don't go say cilia, they don't have this ability to move, and yet in this new configuration it's like, well, we need some way to move now, or you put one kind of cell into a new environment and it does it. And then you said as well, it can even, there's a kind of across generations, it can even retain some of that. And then you're saying,
Potentially.
yeah, okay, right. Yeah, I mean, again, it's weird. You talk about like a new kind of biology. It's something I asked Michael Levin about is, yeah, if these, like, for example, you change the bioelectricity, you change the configuration of you know, the heads of these worms, and then
Planaria, yeah.
planaria, yeah, and then it's in some way, you cut that head off, and but if it does regrow it, or if it when it replicates, it will still have that same configuration. You didn't change the DNA though, so it's gonna. And so you say, okay, so for example, one thing I talked to Michael Levin about is then even thinking about biology just in terms of DNA. Kind of, we need to think more expansively about what and where do these different kinds of competencies come from. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to think about how we should then think about different strands of biology, how evolution kind of works.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This planaria examples are great. It's like one of the first things I read about from Mike's work that I was like, because I worked in rats in my PhD and looking at memory. Um, and one of Mike's I'd say pretty cool planaria works, and I won't go into too much detail, but they have these dishes, and they taught planaria where food was with different surfaces on the petri dish, so like rough or smooth. Um, and what's interesting is when you taught them this, if you put like a harmful light, also if they knew where the food was, they would still go in there and grab it and get out. So the idea is like, okay, they're willing to. This is also cool. An organism is willing to risk kind of stress and harmful perturbations in order to get a food. Like that's cool. They're just dumb worms, but they were able to like figure it out and go and do this thing. And what's cool is they cut off the heads of all the worms that learned these things and threw them away. And when all their heads grew back, a good number of them remembered where the food was. Now they do have most of their brains are in their heads, but they do have neurons along their body, kind of like a spinal cord. It's a bad relationship, but it looks like a ladder. So it's not like every neuron was removed, but like the majority of them were. Yet they still kind of remember some of these things. None of the DNA changed. None of this changed. So like then you have so a new question we've learned from this very weird thing is like, okay, where does memory sit then, especially in a system like this? Then since we're on planaria, another great example is they introduced barium into the water of these planaria, and it's not naturally occurring in their environments, so they shouldn't have any way to know how to deal with a new threat, and their heads degenerate or explode. But very quickly, most of them will literally alter their 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 DNA, different parts of their genome, and regrow heads that are barium resistant within like a week. So it's crazy. That example more speaks to the fact that there's like deep competencies that we were probably never aware of. Then when you start pairing that with like robotics, engineering, synthetic biology, and I would even say that the barium example is a bit synthetic. It never saw barium, so I would say it's a new thing and therefore slightly synthetic. We learned this idea that they can alter themselves quite readily. Then when you pair that with other systems, now you might get to understand more. Um, it's pretty radical. A guy that explores this a lot in Europe is Andreas Wagner. If you're looking for new people to interview, he's very interesting. He works in different systems, but he explores genetic kind of adaptability
Yeah, yeah.
in yeast culture. It's very cool.
I've been looking
Um,
into him. I think I want to talk to him in a few months because yeah, he does work on evolvability
yeah,
in evolution and how you'll have some adaptations which in the short term aren't really effective and but they can eventually kind of come out and or yeah and so it's and that's something I think about a lot. And like obviously if an organism doesn't survive until the next generation, then that line is done for. But equally, if it doesn't survive millions of or whatever generations into the future, or thousands, depending how far back you go, then it's not. Then that's gone. So it's and then it's like, okay. So what? How far out should almost evolution look? You know, to when it's picking things. And I don't know if your work says anything about
not
this.
not so much, but you've said something very interesting because I really love this idea of trying to understand biology via goals. You said evolution. How far does it need to look? What does that even mean? I'm not picking on you, but this is like stuff we'll say often, but not really think about the consequences. Like, what does it mean to look forward? What does it mean? What's another thing that's very kind of close to my scientific heart is this idea of like embodiment. So, you know, I'm embodied. So my brain is in my body, and my body's in the world, but it's all part of like the same thing. Where's the delineation between me and the environment? But there's like things in my world that are very important. So it was described in the past as the umwelt, like the meaningful environment for an organism. Um, and that is very closely tied to this idea of goals, right? So if I'm going to have goals, they're probably going to be based upon the umwelt, like the things that are important to me, the signaling. So if you take that idea and then instead of me, think about being some generational thing like bacteria um, or yeast. If your organism is like the colony and you're trying to navigate some cross generational landscape, like what is the umwelt? Like what the hell are they looking at in order to say like I know it's bad now, but I'm on my way? Like what? Like where does that sit? How does it like 3 generations from now? How does it know that like man they sacrificed by hitting that dip, but now I'm up, I'm going up, and we got to keep changing. I have no idea, and I don't think anyone knows necessarily where that's stored. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
Because if you make like a human analogy of that, any one person has their own goals, but then we also are part of companies and families and all these different kinds of organizations, and we you can contribute to them, and or that, and so you could say like that entity,
Yeah.
a business, an organization, it itself has to have goals different to any of the individual things within it, and it's not really necessarily an entity all by itself. But then, as you say with yeast and a colony, though, in a way evolution is in part acting on the colony as a whole. So to what degree can we say that, yeah, how can we understand it and what its perspective is, so to speak, whatever that means? Because we tend to think about, let's say, the consciousness or the perspective of one
Mhm.
specific organisms, but where do we draw that line? And how should we think about, a collective, and how it makes goals?
Well, that's a huge question. Okay, I hope you interview me in 15 years when I'm further down my scientific progression and I have some brilliant answer. I mean,
Mm,
so you're part of it. Like for me, I mean that was a good historical example. You know, people wanting to set up kingdoms like the family line or whatever of the dynasties. You know that your children would continue, right? So you know you're trying to like leave something better for them or be stronger or whatever, assuming that's something important to you. Because it may not be for everyone, which is fine. But you realize you're part of some kind of nebulous collective thing. It's even better when you have something like a company or you have some imagine a project that lasts a generation or two. You know you're a part of this like something bigger than yourself. So then the big question that Mike always asks, I ask too, and many of us do, is like my neurons in a tissue, for example, do they know they're in a collective? Like, do they know they're working towards something, or are they just these little things that happen to be doing what they're doing, and like by accident they're a collective? I don't think so. But then you'd have to ask the question, like, is there some way? And this is what my favorite thing to do, especially with people who do a lot of theory work, which is really important in science, is to ask like, what's an experiment? Like, how could I know that let's say you have a collective, whatever it is, I don't care the system. It could be an economic collective, that's fine. How do you test? How do you know that an agent in that collective knows that it's in a collective, or does it?
mm,
And how does that maybe? Because some might not, right? Like a bad actor or something that's disconnected. Cancer is a really good example. The way that it works, it kind of shuts itself off and makes and like cuts itself off from the collective and becomes very selfish and eventually eats the whole system. Um, so that's the big question: is like, can you experimentally probe this question?
yeah. And has anyone come up with anything good? Because that seems like a really good.
No.
Yeah.
I mean,
'Cause-
there's lots of, I say that very dismissively. Tons of people have ideas, some good, maybe some wacky, but yeah, no one, I've never seen a paper that's like, here was my idea and here's me proving it in a way that
Mm,
is functional and
yeah.
meaningful.
To riff on that, something I've been thinking about, like that, say that question on a human level is, sometimes you'll rationally, logically think, okay, this day I have this thing to do in the morning that's really important. If I don't complete this coursework, I won't finish my degree or whatever. But then there might be a part of you that's like, but actually I could do this. I could wait a bit and do this coursework later. And I don't, there's the fact, and then your body will almost. So I'm just wondering. There's almost a feeling of my cells here, everything, every part of me is like not really there. There are some activities which everything feels like it's contributing and everything feels kind of cohered together and like, okay, we're all going for this. And there are some things you find something really boring and your body, the things drifting away. Actually, this is a bit more interesting to me, and it's hard for you to say concentrate. And so I don't know. I just like I don't know if we necessarily need to. Like when you ask that question of how can we test whether, say, a cell knows it's part of a, it depends what we mean by know, right? There might be some way in which it's getting communication, but I mean, you know, uh, you can't question it, and like, does it, rationally know, can articulate that it's part of a collective? But also probably, I mean, the thing is that with us, if it doesn't properly coordinate with the collective, then it is more likely to die. Um, so you can imagine it. There's some way it needs to know. Um, but then also it's weird because individual cells can they can kill themselves in our own
Yeah.
collective, which is also really strange. I
Yeah.
don't know why and how things do that.
I mean, it could be. I imagine you're in some part of some collective, but I think you touched on something important. Is like when a higher order comes down, so some drive to the collective. I think that's a good way to test of like, is it part of a collective? Because when you give some kind of top down command, and they all shift to follow, they're in a collective. They're moving together. They're a part of the group. If like a couple of cells break off and do something else, then you'd have to experimentally test. Okay, was that part of the plan, or are they like going rogue? But I think for when cells kill themselves, it could be that the the collective needs some action, and they realize they can't participate, or their cycles are spent, and so they have just some auto shutdown process. Because uh, a lot of times, if they die in weird ways, they can release a lot of toxins, and things like this. So it could be like a nice way to self destruct. I have not,
Mm, mm.
these
The way,
are people can guess at these things, but no one really knows why they happen.
yeah, the way I'm thinking about it, and in an analogy is, if you're going to work in this collective, you cells, you're signing this kind of contract. And so if certain conditions are met, like you're going to be self-destructing, and it's like, okay, well, overall it's better that I'm part of this collective, and I'll, if that happens, fair enough, I self-destruct, but
Yeah.
but we're like, what can we find those mechanisms? Yeah. Yeah. It's a well, I'm interested in to kind of switch topics, or just take what we've been doing here, and I'm interested in, given that we have this kind of control of organisms, but we can't control the tiny little details because organisms aren't like clocks. So how should we think about things like medicine, what these things can do for us, these hybrids?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one that I didn't think about too hard earlier in my career, but now I think about a lot, is how is any of this applicable? Um, and I think there will be hopefully I mean, I think there'll be a shift in medicine later, not right now. Most of my grants, if they touch anything medicine related, get immediately shut down. But I think the idea of treating a collective, a person, through these ideas of like trainability and collective communication rather than mechanical change, I think is the future of medicine. At least to me, it's just what makes sense. I think in the past we thought, oh, man is machine. If machine broke, we find peace and change it, and then machine better. But collectives, sometimes referred to, like people will talk about them as complex systems sometimes. They don't work that way. You can't just like fix the one piece. So if you go in and micromanage one piece, that's very, very, very hard. The amount of work and effort needed to exert control over those, like a clock piece. Like, let's say you want to take apart a clock and change how it ticks because it's not ticking correctly. It takes, we have a literal profession for that, a watchmaker. that's going to have to go in because they have such high mechanistic knowledge that they have this, and also the hands to go in and do all this stuff. So when you think that as a human, that's kind of the path that medicine has taken. It's, something is wrong. We're going to go in and edit this one thing or do this one specific thing and try to get out. But even with pharmaceuticals, this happens. You give a medicine, but then that has some crazy rebound. So now you have to take this medicine, which causes this thing to do weird. So maybe you have to have a third, and then don't forget you also have to have this to make sure that everything doesn't explode. And it's fine. But I think we don't abuse the fact that biology is pretty competent. And once we figure out how medicine can work by like trying, it sounds stupid, but like persuade the system to be more like what you think you want it to be. And sometimes, because it could be that, they want to go there, but there's some kind of energy, there's some kind of barrier to get there. So with a little bit of training, a little bit of effort, you might be able to get the system back towards something that's more healthy. And I think that's a more radical and interesting way to approach medicine in the future, is through like the trainability of a system. Train yourself to be healthy. No one's going to argue that like exercising doesn't make you healthy. Of course it does. So like, and again, that's training your body to move in certain ways and to get practice of your heart beating, your lungs going. But I think we could apply the same idea to other maladies. It should work.
I like that you use the word kind of persuadability, because as you say, there's loads of interesting stories of, even if you actually think that you've solved a problem. I remember hearing stories. It might have been Bernardo Kashup talking about how maybe someone had like a physical ailment. Okay, you solved that, but then it turned up like psychologically, or they it's not obvious how the system as a whole kind of changes when you try and fix one part of it. And so would you say then that there's a way in which we do you think that this, because I mean, I understand and appreciate that kind of whole perspective approach of, we can't just tell a system to fix itself. We need to see the whole. But is there a way in which, how do we know, though, that kind of begs another question of how do we know from a top-down perspective of what, I mean, almost could rephrase a question as, like, we have a kind of power if we realize that we can set these kind of top-down kind of controls. So it becomes the question of how should we sort of persuade organisms to kind of change. So we don't have the power to individually change things, or if we did, it's almost too difficult. We can leave that for now. But now that we realize this is the interesting approach, I mean, what are the benefits, but what are the dangers?
Yeah. I think the benefits are huge, because the benefit would be train something that you want or persuade in the direction of the thing that you think is beneficial, and then the whole system is going to head towards that if you're communicating it correctly, or in a way that addresses the system as a whole. I guess the dangers, is that one, we might not know what's best. I mean, you could be like, wow, I really want to train this thing because I think it's great. And then when you do it, there's some unattended side effect because you don't, this is all new. The other danger is that it's, abused by people who want to do bad. I mean, social media is a great example. People laugh about the algorithms and the stuff like that. But literally, apps and social media is designed because we know how to train your brain to like it. So it's already happening. It's already being abused a little bit in order to sell things. Capitalism. Woo.
Yay.
So there's one downside already. Is think of how powerful it is. I mean, even myself sometimes, I don't know if you've ever done this. You'll close like Instagram or something, and your brain's like, "Huh, Instagram." And you're like, wait, what the hell? I just closed this. But you don't even think about it. It's almost like a bodily reflex now. Think about if you took that, but you wanted to do good instead, or something that's better than that. And I think so. That's the pro. Imagine the power of social media, that trainability, that like need to get on, to swipe, to do stuff.
Mm.
Imagine if instead of that, someone had done something good. Not that social media is inherently bad in and of itself; it is just abused. So imagine if you could, train for
Mm.
something nice instead of an addiction.
Yeah, well, you can imagine. So, like, if someone's if the people creating and sort of improving improving social media systems to make them say more addictive and just get us to spend more time on it, it's like they really understand that relation between us and this machine. So you could,
Hmm.
in the language that we've been speaking about, you could argue that's an a way kind of hybrid kind of thing.
Yeah.
But but instead of making things so that they couple really strongly, you could also imagine systems that help you kind of decouple or
Decouple.
set new goals. I mean, actually, Ben White at the University of Sussex, I had him on with the cognitive scientist Mark Miller, and he's doing work on the cognitive science of technology and
Hmm.
how we can have like help have technology be sort of a benefit, and how it might need to have these kinds of, instead of we use it for a specific end, how can it actually afford us and give us actually more agency? Because with the social media thing, and or just so many things in our lives, it's you're like, why do I even have this? It's just stopping me from pursuing other goals. And you're like, please
Yeah.
stop. Yeah.
Please. Yeah. How do you decouple? No, it's really interesting. I think the the unf- there's like a couple of unfortunate truths is that our society is extremely built around having money. It's like the most important thing in general. So the moment there's something that you want to create, most of the time, I mean, even in a perfect world, you have to. I mean, you need to be able to live, right? And unfortunately, money is required to live. You have to have a house and eat food and stuff like that. So when you build these systems, you typically you need to kind of make money off of this thing. So who in their right mind at Instagram or Facebook or Meta or whatever would invest or even allow someone to readily work on something that will decouple you from the system that they created to keep you engaged, to keep you spending money? Uh, so it's really difficult. But if you could, then those systems that help you decouple and stuff like that. I mean, essentially, you're paying for like when people quit smoking, you're paying for some kind of path forward out of your addiction. Um, but then you have to pay for that too. I don't know. It's really tricky.
Mm.
No one's going to give unfortunately anything away for free because capitalism kind of broke us. And so I think it's really interesting. And you mentioned it. Like I think we are embodied in this world that now your phone is almost a part of you. I mean, many people talk about this. It's not like I'm not saying anything extremely new. Um, but yeah, it's like almost synthetic. You and your phone are this like one agent, and it would be
Mm.
very cool if there was a future in which that was for the good rather than just for money making. Whatever that means, it should give us more agency and more ability to do good and to create new things, not to like trap us in these. I don't know. I'll just leave it at that. Now I'm just philosophizing about nothing.
No, no, good. I like that you bring up the kind of, the natural cyborg hypothesis of that we kind of are part of our phones or any part of our environment. I was thinking just yesterday, I was walking around the lake and I was like, if my phone fell in the lake, like anything else, I wouldn't really care. But I'm like, if it's like, what would I even do? Because I use my phone to solve problems. So now I'm like,
Yeah,
who am I gonna call so I can get a new phone? Like, what am I
yeah.
gonna do? You know? Okay. What is the future of your work? Or what are you planning sort of in the near future? What are you excited about?
Okay. But before I move on to that, I'll say one thing because it's related to my work in the future. You drop your phone in the lake and your host. And you made an interesting point. A lot of your cognitive capability is now there. You've offloaded it there so that your mind can do other things or do nothing. Sometimes that's nice too. And that's, I think, really, really, really important. Um, but you have to be aware, a bit aware that when you pass your cognitive ability to something else, you may lose it. Like I know lots of people who essentially cannot navigate at all because they are wholly dependent on their phone. I grew up before cell phones, it's not the only thing, but when you pass off your competency to an outside system, like using ChatGPT to process any information that you want from the world, you have to be a bit careful because you may lose some of those competencies. And then you're dependent upon the system. And if the system is being sold to you by someone, then that's a whole other thing.
Hmm.
So
Really, that
that's,
yeah,
oh,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
I like that a lot because I've found ChatGPT very useful for coding or just
It's
helping
great.
fix paragraphs and write. But then I do think, well, for example, I remember talking to Maxwell Ramstead about the energy consumption of different uh, AI, and like it's so easy to rely on these kinds of things, but it's not obvious or that one can sustain them, or just who knows. It's I think technology in general, hearing philosophers talk about it, it expands what you can do, but it also makes you more fragile, right? It kind of it's a layer that sort of protects you from the world and expands your capacities, but you then as a base organism, you could say, and again, it's hard to know their boundaries now, but yeah, then that maybe has less, and you have to then it kind of makes you less resilient if any one of these tools does kind of go away. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the extreme case where like you can pass an entire competency to an outside system, you're now a collective with this system. I mean, and imagine if we're a system, if you, you know, we've passed off all of our cognitive ability or a lot of it into our minds and not into our bodies still are very capable and have a cognitive system in my mind all on its own, right? But human beings, most of our cognitive abilities have been offloaded into the piece of technology that we call brain. And if I cut that off, yeah, you die for sure. Your body without your brain is done for. So you could say like, oh, your system was made more fragile by offloading the cognitive load into the brain. In the same way that if you were to offload your competencies into technology, and let's imagine an extreme example where it's a pure like you go from having all the competency to none of it, and you rely on an external thing to do it. Yeah, you yourself are less because you've given something away, but you as a collective are more, potentially,
Mm.
especially if the capability that you gave is now higher in the thing that you gave it to. Then great, then I've only improved. And yeah, you're more fragile, but then ideally, as a collective, you would come up with some way to stay coherent and not break apart. Um, that's like, I mean, as humans become more cybernetic over time, it's something we're going to be very, very explicit about how you pass competencies and the robustness of the system. It's why I'm always really nervous when basically billionaire companies are doing some of this because they have never ever is there a billionaire or a person that's doing this that has your best interests at heart. That's just not the way of it. So it's a bit scary. Um, but what's very cool though, and goes to my future work and stuff like that, so smooth transition on my part,
Awesome.
is often we talk about using the technology to better um, exist in the world around us, or to communicate and be in the world. What if we turned it and let the technology better understand us? And Mike and I have had this conversation many times. Um, let's say there is a future where we have no idea how the body. I have no idea how my liver works. I mean, I do in general, right? But um, what if on my phone, because we still have phones in the future, or my brain chip, or wherever all that crap is sitting, um, it's going to be my birthday. People are going to buy me drinks for sure. I don't mind drinking every once in a while. So I know a bad thing is coming. And I say, hey, liver, again, you know what you're doing, not me. But I am going to drink sometime, and probably a little more than I should. What can I do to help you out? And it says, like, there's nothing you can do, but the next day you're going to, we can use this and this. Or what if your liver could, like, report back and say, like, if you would eat a banana and an Oreo, don't ask why, but I'm going to be good to go. That would be great. So being able to interface, so the future of
Mm.
my work, for me personally, of course, I have like scientific questions about all of this, but in terms of like the tangible stuff, I would really, the goal of some of my work is like, how do you interface with biology in such a way that makes it um, more understandable and how you can almost engineer it such that it's more easily communicatable with, regardless of the biology that you're speaking about. And in that frame, can you train it? Can you do stuff like, hey, liver, I maybe I'm gonna be sorry. The liver was maybe a bad suggestion, but it's like, hey, I need to train you to do better, man. Every time I have 2 beers, I feel terrible the next day. No matter how many times I do it, you're always failing me. Please. And it can say like, hey, imagine it can text you back like, hey, my guy, if you would just do these things, like I'd be better equipped. Or like, can you train it in order to handle certain situations better than others? I'll not share this podcast to my mother. Speaking of drinking so much.
I'm thinking of even imagine pre-warning your liver. I mean, maybe it's like I would be fine if you just told me, and then I can ramp up some things.
Yeah, ahead of
But now I'm
time rather
just
than
suddenly
after the
like,
fact.
yeah, I'm suddenly just imploding now.
Yeah, exactly. Or say you love spicy food, but your body doesn't respond well to it. Is there a way you can like talk to it or interface with it such that it could give you a heads up? Like, yeah, if you would just drink some milk and let me know, then I'll get the stuff ramped up. Then and you'll be fine, which would be very cool. But you could extend that to things in the future, or something like a passion project of mine that I really want to work on, because I worked in epilepsy in my PhD, and lots of work has gone into making epilepsy better in the world. But there's a huge percentage of the population, like 33%, that's I think it's like a third, that are pharmacoresistant, meaning like drugs don't do anything. And there's this very gross graph that's looking at the number of drugs like to treat epilepsy in the world has like skyrocketed, and the percentage of pharmacoresistance stays relatively the same. Like we really haven't made a dent in this disease. Epilepsy is really hard. A lot of work has gone into understanding how it functions. There's some great work. I think their last name is Baud, Maxine Baud, looking at they have multi-DN rhythms epileptic patients do, where they were pharmacoresistant. They have implants, so they have devices that monitor, and every patient has this multi-day kind of almost like a rhythm where they almost know where the seizures are coming, and that's already a huge advancement because they know it, so they can prep in advance. But what if I could know and then slowly train my brain to stop? Like, what if there's some type of neurofeedback, whether it's stimulation, whether it's magnetic resonance, I mean, whatever it is. What if there's some way to communicate to your cells like what you're doing is going to result in a seizure, a potentially lethal one? Like, quit it. Like, stop doing that, please. And it might not be possible for it to do it on its own. Like I said, there might be some barrier. Like, it knows, let's say, that it's up against a wall and it can't get past it. What's something you can do in order, imagine a maze that looks like this, it's something, all it can do is go down, like, it can't pass it. It's a bit dumb in this sense. It's trapped. Like, it would just take, someone being like, hey, what if you did this? And then it can pass it and then it's fine. It might get stuck, but eventually it learns to dodge it. So you kind of give it a bit more competency in the space that it's in order to fix it. I think that the brain has already a remarkable capability to heal itself. It just might need a little bit of a push. So that's it's a sorry I rambled on for a second. It's something I care a lot about. So I think medicinally stuff like, and that goes back to our conversation earlier. I think parts of that are the future. Neurofeedback is already in the world today to help people with like attention problems. And sometimes things like depression. So can you train your brain to not? And I think you can. I think it's very doable.
Great, awesome. Well, I've really enjoyed this.
Oh, thanks.
And yeah, so thank you, Wesley.
Mm-mm.